2. So that's directly from the Federal Motor Carrier Association, and that just kind of outlines the bare basics of it. So if a driver has a sleeper berth, the 10-hour break can be accomplished by taking the following: at least 10 hours off duty, at least 10 hours consecutive in the sleeper berth time, a combination of consecutive sleeper berth and off-duty time amounting to at least 10 hours. So those 3 options are available if a driver or truck has a sleeper berth. If there's no sleeper berth in the truck, then these wouldn't apply in any way. But if they do, they have those 3 options along with this 4th one, which is the split sleeper rule. And that is the equivalent of at least 10 hours consecutive off-duty if the driver does not comply with paragraph, and then this information below here in this section.
Yes. Ryan, so the first one would be if they don't have a sleeper berth, they can accomplish the 10 hours in just off duty. So they can use that one, but obviously anywhere where it says SB or sleeper berth, if you don't have a sleeper berth, you can't use that option. So if you don't have a sleeper berth, you just have to get the 10 consecutive hours off duty, and you're on your off duty line. And you can also use off duty personal conveyance, which for the 2 separate hour break, either used before your 8 consecutive hours in sleeper berth or after. That can be a combo, including the personal conveyance off duty as well.
Great.
Okay, and then the last one, what we're talking about, that is the split sleeper. So number 4 is we're going to figure out what that equivalent is. And the whole main reason you're doing this is instead of having 10 consecutive hours off, you can split that 10 hours off to get different hours, or you get hours back for your 11-hour drive time or your 14-hour window. So what does equivalent mean, Ryan?
Yeah, so this first one, the term equivalent of at least 10 consecutive hours off duty means a period of at least 8 hours, but less than 10 consecutive hours in the sleeper berth. And number 2 would be a separate period of at least 2 hours, but less than 10 consecutive hours, either in SB or off duty, or any combination thereof. So the key there again is that theoretically, they're going to be taking time in the sleeper berth of at least 8 hours, less than 10, and then there's a separate period of 2 hours where they could use a couple different methods of being off-duty to capture that. So a couple other bullet points of that, number 2 below. You must spend at least 8 hours consecutively, but less than 10 consecutive hours in sleeper berth. This 8 hours of sleeper berth will not count as part of your 14-hour window. So that time in the split sleeper, once it's accrued, does not count against your 14-hour window of operation in the day. So remember your 11 and your 14-hour clock. So the 14-hour clock would not have that 8 hours removed. A second separate rest period must be at least 2 consecutive hours long. This second period may be spent in the sleeper berth off-duty or sleeper berth off-duty combined. And that one does count towards your 14-hour window. So that second 2-hour one, or if you do the first one, the second one first, I should say, of 2 hours, that also would count towards your 14. And it doesn't matter what you take first, so you can either do your 8 or your 2 first. And after you complete your second required rest break, you'll have a new point on the clock from which to calculate your hours available. So this new calculation point will be at least the time you completed your first required rest period. So that's the basics of the sleeper berth rule. We try to make it as simple as possible. There's a few different scenarios and ways you can do it, but again, the basics are it's 2 periods of 8 hours and 2 hours, either order, but the 8 hours does have to be spent in the sleeper berth, and it doesn't count against your 14-hour window. The second 2-hour period does count against your 14-hour clock.
Yes, so here now we're going to cover some tips on reviewing the split sleeper rule. So what we're going to do first, there's a couple ways since the split sleeper is a little complicated. So we're going to walk through some scenarios this is going to be on his driver normal day on how he would use this. And then we've got a chart and a graph to look at a little bit after this. But so say the driver comes to work at 7 a.m. and we're going to assume that before this he had either a 34-hour reset or 10 consecutive hours off. He didn't use a split sleeper. So he just came in at 7 a.m. and he's on duty for 3 hours. So after 3 hours, the driver starts driving at 10, so that's 4 hours. So we have a cumulative 7 hours of on-duty time here. So note that the driver goes into sleeper berth at 2 p.m. for 8 hours and starts driving again at 10. So if you're counting a normal 14-hour break here, at 7 a.m., you go to 7 p.m. and then add 2 hours, that's 9. So at 9 p.m., the driver would be normally ending his first 14-hour window. However, since the driver has initiated the split sleeper or sleeper berth, they go into the sleeper for 8 hours. At 9 o'clock, if the driver started driving, or they would be in violation, but he's completed an 8-hour split sleeper, so he starts driving again at 10. That is the first in the cycle of his first 8-hour break. So the 14-hour clock at that point was extended from 9 p.m. when it would have originally ended to 5 a.m. the next day. So that's where you're going to get that 8 hours. So that 8-hour sleeper berth period extended the 14-hour clock on that time. So what some of our drivers and a lot of questions that we get in is at the end of this first 8-hour sleeper berth period, the driver is assuming they get a full 14 hours at the end of that break. They don't. They just get that 8 hours back. Most people sleep 8 hours, so 8 hours is a good break. So Federal Motor Carrier says, hey, okay, you take 8 hours off. That's good. You're rested. You can extend your 14-hour window. So if it's a little bit challenging or difficult to do that type of math, what you can do is if the driver knows they're going to use a split sleeper, they're going to use that 8-hour period first. When they start their day here at 7 a.m., instead of saying, okay, I'm going to count 14 hours from 7 a.m., and then when I complete an 8-hour break, I'm going to get that time back, I'll just say at 7 a.m., I have a 22-hour window in which to drive. So that at the end, at 22 hours, then they're going to say, okay, at that point in time, I need to take another break or I need to do something. So at 10 p.m., the driver then has his extended window until 5 a.m. to drive the remaining 7 hours available. And that 7 hours was, I looked at before my break, before that split sleeper break, I said, okay, how many hours did I drive? I drove for 4 hours. So I will take 11, which is what I get, minus 4 is 7. So I have 7 hours now to drive. So the driver has to take the second break at 5 a.m. That's the end of that window. So at 5 a.m. they take the break, and that completes the split sleeper cycle. So they go 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. At 7 a.m., now that could be off-duty, sleeper berth, or off personal conveyance all combined, just as long as it's consecutive. So at 7 a.m., the driver has then fulfilled their split sleeper cycle, okay? And at that point, they can reset their calculation point. So this is something, and I want you to think about words that we're using here. We're reviewing this, and we're using certain words like break, recalculation point, drive hours, things like that. So the recalculation point is going to be at the end of the first rest break, not the second rest break, which is a lot of what drivers get confused about as well, is now they get the full 14 hours here because they have actually completed a cycle. Remember, we're trying to do the 10-hour break, but we split it up. So Federal Motor Carrier doesn't say, oh, 8 is okay. They still make you take the 10. And at that point, your recalculation point is at the end of your first break, which was at 10 p.m. So at 10 p.m., you now have 14 hours in which to drive another 11 hours, okay? So at that point, you get your drive hours, again, recalculated. And if you look at that, the driver has used 9 hours of that window. So he has 5 hours left out of the 14-hour clock and 7 hours left of time to drive, 7 hours of drive time that he completed, so he's got 4 left. So to get more hours using the sleeper berth provision, the driver at noon must take another 8 hours in the sleeper berth. And then after that, after you do that, the recalculation point again will be the end of the second hour break at 7 a.m. So it's kind of a moving cycle. There's a moving flow. The driver doesn't have to roll and keep using the split sleeper. They might only use it once in a week or twice in a week. They could keep using it over and over again, but when they keep using it over and over again, just make sure that the tip is that the recalculation point will keep moving based on the completion of each break. So a tip is it's good to keep in mind that it's based on the 10-hour rule, that it's cyclical in nature, and that it's complete when those 10 hours of rest have been recorded. And then make sure that at the end of each break, you're looking at the drive time right before and right after that break, and that you're setting your recalculation point only after you've completed a cycle or a 10-hour cycle, which is going to be, we'll show here in a minute, guided by when that 8 full hours in the sleeper berth has been taken. Anything to add on that, Ryan?
No, that was actually a perfect summary. I think making this as simple as possible is pretty important, just because, this isn't really critical for drivers that, as Susan mentioned, it's something that, with paper logs, a lot of them did do it incorrectly with the best intentions, of course. But really the key is just make sure to emphasize to the drivers that until they complete that 10 hours, it's not going to reset that cycle.
Right. But they do get, as soon as the 8 hours in the sleeper berth, like what I was talking about first, is that 8 hours, because think of it logically. When you've taken 8 hours of a rest break in that sleeper berth, you're rested. You're okay. So you get those hours back. You're able to extend the 14-hour clock. But the drive hours and things like that, until the cycle is complete, Federal Motor Carrier says, nope, you still have to do that. So now we're going to give you some tips on what we just covered, so hopefully it can help you kind of think about it another way, because we're trying to make this as simple as possible. And this was quite a doozy for me to understand when I first started doing hours of service. It was the hardest one, that anytime anybody said split sleeper, I would just say, don't do it. But now, with the advent of ELDs, it makes it a lot simpler. So a tip, so any period in the sleeper berth of at least 8 consecutive hours does not count as part of the 14-hour driving window, okay? Like we just said. Now, if the 2-hour break that you have that completes the cycle is taken either before or after that 8 hours in the sleeper berth, this time is counted as part of your 14-hour window. Again, a 2-hour break is not considered like a big break period, but it is when you couple it with an 8-hour break period in the sleeper berth. So the driver is allowed to do non-driving work after that 14-hour limit is reached, just like, regular paper log, just no more truck driving. So keep in mind, whether you use the split sleeper as a one-off or you continually use it, that you still have to monitor your weekly hours. So your 16, 7-hour duty limits still apply. So if you're doing a lot of on-duty work, you're not taking a 34-hour reset, you're utilizing the split sleeper instead. You still have to make sure that you're looking at your weekly totals. And you could do that on the ELD by going to the home screen and tapping those compliance counters that show you your time available. And then it takes you to a rolling view, and you could look at the hours that you have for each day. It adds up your limit so that you can make sure that you're not running out of hours there. So thinking of the split sleeper as a cycle and systematically checking for that proper recalculation point is probably the number one thing that people have challenges with. They're not understanding when the cycle ends, which break that they're going to use, and things like that. But if you are knowing that every time that 8-hour sleeper berth period, that is not counting as the 14-hour window, and then as soon as your cycle is completed, at the end of that, you're setting your proper recalculation point, which is at the end of your first valid break period, you'll be okay. So each time one of the 2 required rest break is taken, the on-duty and the driving hours available will have to be recalculated. That's the driver's responsibility. Again, hours of service rules haven't changed. And then make sure that you check the drive time between breaks to ensure that they don't go over the limit before fulfilling the split break. So that's another thing we get, is they set their recalculation point incorrectly, and that they're looking at their drive hours and they don't fulfill that second part of the break in time. So then when they start driving again, it puts them in violation. So they can be on duty as much as they want. It won't show a violation, but we get a lot of drivers that are confused saying, hey, I started driving and it put me in violation. I don't understand why. Well, you might not have taken that break, that second break in time, and you didn't get the split sleeper, which means the 14 hours is going to be off, as well as your 11-hour. So the drive time just before and after each break period is the same. It can't be more than 11 hours until you fulfill that cycle. Then you can reset that. And I also want to make sure that folks understand out there, the compliance counters that are on our device, or it could be on another device, those aren't an ELD mandate requirement. Those are compliance tools. That's an extra feature that can assist the drivers with understanding their hours of service and what they have left, so that they know. But it is still up to the drivers to know how much time that they have left. Those are tools. And sometimes the technology, whether there was cell phone coverage issues, or maybe there was a power compliance malfunction thrown or something like that. So sometimes those counters may be off due to the technology not working for some reason, some valid reason. So make sure that the drivers, you can go to the home screen and go to the logs icon, and the drivers can review their logs that day plus the previous 7 to look at their hours and look at their log as they normally would on a paper log. So if your drivers are doing the split sleeper on paper, they're used to doing it that way, and it's hard for them to kind of look at the counters and understand, they still have an option to look at the logs by going to the logs icon, look at the hours right before, kind of visualize their logs like they're used to on a graph grid, and be able to check to see their hours that way as well. It's easier for me. That's what I do because I'm a very visual person. So just make sure that they understand that. And also that those compliance counters aren't shown during an inspection, and no violations are uploaded during a roadside inspection. It's only raw log data. So the driver, as long as he's doing the split sleeper correctly, will always be fine. They won't get a citation or violation that's not shown and uploaded during an inspection. Okay, so on our ELD, Ryan, can you want to cover some of these things, how the logic works on our eRoad ELD?
Sure. Yep, so start with number 1. If the driver takes the 2-hour break first, that time will not be taken off, reflected on the device until the second rest period of 8 hours in the sleeper berth has been completed. So no change in counters until the end of the second break. And the second one, if the driver takes the 8-hour sleeper berth break first, as soon as the 8 hours are recorded and the driver changes duty status, those hours are added to the 14-hour window, reflected on the 14-hour counter. So, one thing about the way we kind of set these webinars up, I'll mention this point really quick, that we really design these as kind of a train-the-trainer model. So, as we go through these points, I think it's worth Susan and I pointing out a couple areas that we get the most questions on. So, in my role and working with the part of our business that deals directly with talking to drivers that call in to support, for example, I know that anecdotally, probably the question we get by far the most revolves around when that reset happens, when they get those hours back. So drivers are always, calling and thinking that it's after the second rest period. So really just emphasizing it's after the first 8 hours of sleeper berth time. That's the point when they get the reset hours. Moving down, the ELD will count the new time available for the driver's remaining hours of service from the end of the first valid break period. So again, really emphasizing that it's the first valid break period. And so this is the most common misunderstanding for many drivers. And again, anecdotally, that's the one we get by far the most questions on. So if you're introducing drivers to this for the first time, or if you're going to do a refresher with the drivers, it's a good idea to even print out this presentation and give it a copy to the drivers to have on hand, just really emphasizing that point. Another one, no violations are transferred to eRods during roadside inspections. So as Susan mentioned, we don't point those out for enforcement. That's up to them to figure out on their own. And then driver hours available will only update after the second rest period has been completed, reflected on the 11-hour counter.
Yes, so again, all of the 8 hours must be in the sleeper berth. So if the driver is splitting up that 8-hour sleeper berth period, it won't give them a split sleeper break. And then the first 2-hour break, the ELD isn't psychic. It doesn't know that you're going to initiate a split sleeper cycle. It can just look at it like an off-duty period or an off-duty personal commands period or sleeper berth period. It doesn't know. I know that there's some other devices out there that initiate split sleeper at certain times, but on our device, we don't tell it that, hey, this could be a split sleeper until it has been paired with that second period. So when you take the first 2-hour break, you're not going to see anything reflected on the counters at all. So it's only when it's been coupled with the 8 hours that there will be a change. And if the driver does take the 8-hour split sleeper first, you will see a change. However, we do get the question, so that the 8 hours have been completed and they're going, oh, my counters didn't change. Well, again, the device doesn't know what you're doing. You have to actually change status out of sleeper berth. And if you change to off-duty, it's not going to do anything. You have to change to an on-duty status, and then it goes, oh, okay, so we've completed this break because another status was initiated. And then you will see on the 14-hour counter the hours reflected that you have available, because it adds it at that point. Because the 8 hours is it's a lot of break, right? Most people sleep 8 hours. Well, most people sleep less than 8 hours in this day and age. And then again, the ELD counts the new time available from the end of the first break, but it doesn't know it's a first break unless you couple it. Make sure that you understand it's a cycle, but it doesn't go after the last break, like Ryan said. Okay, so here's another visual. So I used this as a tool when I had been training, and I'm trying to teach folks on the question that we get is, okay, so how many hours do I have left to drive? And so this is a good visual. So if this is something that you need, just help your drivers do out a little table, do a little chart. You can print these out in blank or whatnot, and just have them write out their duty statuses, or they could look at their logs by going to the logs icon. So their start time, their end time, there's the duty status, and then those are your hours used. So if you see here, right before that 8-hour sleeper berth block, the driver has 7 hours of driving time, okay? 1 on-duty hour. And then right after that, so if you do, so there's 7 hours, so after that 8-hour period, you take 7 minus 11, which, Brittany, what's 7 minus 11? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 4, right? Sorry, I'm terrible at math. I'm a finger counter. So then it's
what's my 3?
3?
Or no, I'm sorry. No, my math's even worse.
Ryan's worse at math than I am. That's terrible. Okay, so
we're the 2 experts doing the sleeper berth.
I know. Can't take 11 minus 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Brittany here, she's the smart one. So 4. So you're going to look at the time period right before your sleeper berth, and if you're wondering how many hours do I get to drive after that, 11 minus 7, I got 4 hours. So I've got 4 hours after I take that 8-hour sleeper berth. And like you see here, the driver utilized that 2, 3, 4. And then you say, well, after that 8-hour sleeper berth, how many hours do I have to do it in? What does my window look like? Oh, well, what time did you start driving? 12. Okay, so you can either add 22 hours from there, or you go to when your normal 14 would have been up, and then you add 8 from there. So that gives you your window in which you have to drive that 4 hours. We can count. And then you know what time you have to take that second break. If you don't take that second break that time, deal's off. Once you drive again, you're out of hours. You're going to get both an 11 and a 14-hour violation. So I like using a chart like this. It's very visually easy for me to understand. So depending on how your drivers learn, this might be a good tool for you to use. I used to use it too when I would be auditing logs, just so that I can kind of see what was going on. Thank God we didn't have a lot of drivers that used the split sleeper, but we did have a few that utilized it once in a while. And also sometimes they'll use it and they'll not be aware that they used it. So if you do see a sleeper berth period of 8 hours and they're wondering, well, geez, why am I not in violation here? Why are my hours all wonky? Well, if they've got a solid 8 hours in the sleeper berth, it could have actually coupled them. If they took a 2-hour break in an appropriate amount of time, it actually could have extended their 14-hour clock without them knowing why. And that will happen too. Okay, so real world scenarios. So here's some calls that we have had. So there was a driver and the carrier both called in. So the issue is they were getting 14-hour violations. They were using a split sleeper and they didn't know why. So they wanted to know how the eHubO, which is our in-cab device, was calculating the hours. So what we found, what the answer was the driver had been doing the sleeper berth provision, the split sleeper, incorrectly on the paper, and thought that the logic should be the same. So here's what they were doing. The driver wasn't utilizing the 8 hours in the sleeper berth first. They would take the 2-hour first sleeper berth, which they could do in the middle of the day, and then they took that 2 hours off of their 14-hour clock. So they were 2 hours off. That's not allowed because that 2 hours is included at all times in your 14-hour clock, whether it's taken before or after that 8-hour sleeper berth break. So when they took the 8-hour sleeper berth, they assumed that, all those hours were copacetic when they weren't. So their cycle was off by 2 hours. So you might have your driver that has been doing it incorrectly, and then they want the ELD to actually do it incorrectly as well, when we've built it out to do it the way that it's supposed to be done. A second challenge we had is we had a carrier call. So the driver wasn't understanding when to send his recalculation point. So he was just confused, didn't understand what the hours looked like. So the answer was the 8 hours in the sleeper berth alone does not provide a fresh 14 hours until it's coupled with a second hour break. So the recalculation point, the driver, as soon as they took the 8 hours, he thought that he was getting an immediate 14 on top of that. So it's not 14 because, again, the ELD can't look into the future and know that that other 2 hours is going to be taken or when it's going to be taken, but you get back what you give, right? That's the law of the universe. I put in 8 hours in sleeper berth, you get that 8 hours back. You don't set the recalculation point until the cycle has been complete. So the carrier was under the impression that that 8 hour sleeper berth gave them a new 14-hour clock at that point in time, which it didn't. They didn't understand that only after the second break is taken, then, okay, now I can set my recalculation point from the end of the first break period, then I get my 14 hours, then I can reset everything. But again, you might know when you're going to take that break in the future, but the device doesn't know, and it's not going to give you something that you haven't done. Everything's done in real time. Okay, so Ryan, did you have any other questions or that have come in that can add to that can help people to understand the main ones being the recalculation point setting and then not understanding that 2 hours, whether before or after, doesn't get included in the 14-hour clock?
Nothing for me. I think that was a good summary, Susan. I think, one of the takeaways, obviously, is that this is one area where drivers, they may have mixed feelings sometimes about things like ELDs or technology in the trucks, and which is fully understandable from their perspective. But I do think for things like split sleeper berth provisions, this technology and their ELDs can make their life quite a bit easier, and just making it so they're not having to spend quite so much time doing manual calculations or seeing if violations are going to show up. And conversely, for carriers on the back end, you won't have to spend quite so much time, hunched over paper with a calculator or something, just, going through logbooks, figuring out where a violation should be. Clearly, as, Susan and I showed, if you spend too much time looking at split sleeper logs with calculations, your brain gets a little bit scrambled, and it's a good idea to probably just take a few minutes to go to Taco Bell or Dunkin' Donuts or something to get a break. But, I think that this is really an area that I think ELDs can be very helpful for both drivers and carriers, just to make life a little bit simpler, because it is a really great provision that does allow for more flexibility in the hours of service schedule, which giving more options to drivers if they need it, that's always a good thing.
Yeah, and like in the first example, the walkthrough scenario we did, so if the driver is going into an area, that's why I use that scenario, and also it's one directly from Federal Motor Carrier, so it was easy. They might be driving and they might be coming into town during rush hour traffic. So at 2 o'clock, you know what? I can't do anything. I'm going to be crawling along. Hey, I can utilize a split sleeper here. I could go and sleeper for 8 hours. Rush hour's over. I can go get my load delivered. I have the flexibility, and then I can take a 2-hour break, and then I can keep rolling. I can keep moving. So, like Ryan said, once you figure it out, it's not rocket science. It's just a little bit of a challenge to know, and understanding the terminology.